2 of the History of Medicine talk that I did at USF Osher Senior Learning titled Lister to CRISPR. Now, let's start with the topic of the day, which will be introduced by the famous Google Doodle on the important topic of the day, which is hand washing. Now again, things always go better with Google, as you can see that Google had a doodle coming up to 1 hour almost, so we'll stop here and we'll continue in the series of lectures on history of medicine in next session that I will post later on. Okay, thank you folks. So the famous last Google Doodle was for a Hungarian named Ignaz Semmelweis. It's a tragic story. He was a man ahead of his time, and he was a physician from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who worked in the capital, Vienna. And now in Vienna had a big maternity hospital with 2 divisions, the Division 1, in which the deliveries were done by doctors and medical students, and on the 2nd division it was done by midwives. And Semmelweis made an astute observation that in the section where midwives delivered, the mortality was quite low, and he correctly suspected that this may have been due to the germs that the medical students and the doctors were carrying because they had a habit of walking directly after surgery and autopsy to deliver babies, and the difference was dramatic. It was as big as anywhere from 30% to 5% in the second clinic. And by this time, the germ theory had entered, and it was known that washing hands was useful, and he instituted the practice of cleanliness and cleaning hands with carbolic acid. And this, in his supervision, led to 90% reduction. And that was a dramatic finding, as you can see in this graph. Now, he wrote a book and almost insisted on his colleagues, and he was not a good presenter and was not the easiest person to got a prize for communication abilities. And this idea was rejected because the concept of miasma was well encouraged for thousands of years. And his paper in 1795 on Treatise on Epidemic of Puerperal Fever and his book was neglected, and the ideas were not accepted, and then obviously caused him a great distress. And instead of trying to persuade people, he called them murderers, and this did not go very well. And finally, out of frustration, he went back to Hungary, and whether spontaneously or due to this snub, that he developed mental illness and ended up in the lunatic asylum, and the conditions for mental illness and the treatments were rather drastic and barbaric, and he was beaten to death by the attendants, and he died a miserable existence. Now, before that, just for posterity, an Englishman named Alexander Gordon had proposed this even several years before Semmelweis. And again, this was poo-pooed and was not put into practice. And not to be outdone, it's interesting as to how many major discoveries are done at the same time, that none other than the physician who was better known by his son, the famous Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes II, and his father was a established, well-respected polymath physician, and was, to put it mildly, the Boston Brahmin who was multi-talented, and he had made independent observation of the importance of contagious fever as a cause of puerperal disease. And again, this idea was not well received, and it took a while for it to catch on, as it does with any event-breaking or big drastic changes that are recommended in established practices. Moving on to the other front, which is mental illness, which is an equally, if not more important part of physical illness of human beings. And before, in the early 16th and 17th and 18th century, the treatment of mental illness was there were mental hospitals that had come into existence, but all they did was simply locked up the mentally ill and were treated as freaks and degenerates, and were kept in chain and were treated in a very barbaric manners, and all sorts of crazy treatments were tried, including putting them in a chair that rotated at a fast speed, and including with water therapy and other measures which had no established effect. Now, there was a progressive physician named Pinel in France who advocated more humane treatment of mentally ill, such as including, except for the few violent people, most of the people do not need to be kept in chain. Similar suggestions were recommended by a guy named Maudsley in Britain 100 years later. And then it took a long time to associate mental illness with physical abnormalities in the brain, and it took the founding of neurology, and the man who is rightly called father of neuroscience, named Charcot in France, and to establish cause and effect relationship between mental illness and structural and pathological abnormalities in the human brain. And again, it took another 100 years for the development of more established treatment, such as electroconvulsive therapy, and with the advent of chemistry and new drugs that came into use. And the examples of how mentally ill were treated are well illustrated. Even the king himself was not exempt from being treated with treatment which we would just consider barbaric at the present time. And the word bedlam has come into colloquial English, and which is a short for Bethlehem Hospital, which was one of the first mental hospitals in the outskirts of London. And so much so that the rich and established went as a weekend entertainment to look at the mentally ill with their bizarre behaviors and make fun of them, simply for entertainment purposes. And now this should be interesting to hear that the very first sedative that was available was discovered in the late 19th century, and this was a first synthetic drug which rose with the rise of chemistry, primarily in Germany, and that was one that was still used even in the middle of 20th century, and that was called chloral hydrate. And that was synthetic drug that was devised from the byproduct of urea. And this was, no, I'm sorry, I should correct myself, that chloral hydrate was synthesized by various chemists in Germany, and that was the first hypnotic and sedative drug. And unfortunately, like a lot of drugs that work on the brain, have been abused, and this has been abused as a date rape drug in the modern times. And in the early 20th century, it was used to rob people because it caused amnesia when mixed with alcohol. And the name that came into that got stuck was this was used in Chicago at an Irish bar, and that led to the name Mickey Finn. Now, at the same time, on a chemistry front, the first substance that is occurred naturally in the human body was synthesized in a laboratory, and that was the end of the so-called vitalism theory, that there was a big distinction between the natural world and the physical world. And so that again now continued with the chemical inventions, and the rise of chemistry, as we know, took place primarily in Germany, was that the more appropriate sedative drugs which came as the next generation were called barbiturates, and those were the first drug that were sedative and hypnotic. And the first drug that was marketed by Bayer, the big German giant pharmaceutical company, was called Veronal. And the reason they chose the name Veronal, because Verona was the peaceful Italian town, and the name barbiturates came out due to feast of to put things in proper perspective. Okay, now just to show that the artists were paying attention to the medical establishment, this was one of the famous painting that was commissioned by a businessman named Tate, who, to those of you who are familiar with the London art scene, would recognize the Tate Gallery. And this was an artist named Luke Fildes, and who was given freedom to pick his own subject, and he chose a doctor who comes to his own house when his son was deathly ill at his home, and in a contemplative mood. And it shows the bearing of doctor as a thoughtful physician who had little to offer as a matter of cure, but he's doing his best under trying circumstances. Now, the big event on, and especially when it comes to Britain, was Dr. Joseph Lister, who was familiar with Louis Pasteur's work on the other side of the English Channel. Now, he initially got his start while working to try to solve a problem for the wine industry, where the wine was getting spoiled, and this was thought to be that this was due to spontaneous generation of germs, and he did some elegant experiments on air and disproved the idea that the germs, that there was spontaneous generation, and based on that, trying to solve the problem of the wine industry. And so this was his start. And at the same time, he carbolic acid, which we know commonly as phenol, was a byproduct of the coal tar industry. And this he came up, he had accepted the idea of germ theory and started using carbolic acid as a spray. Now this again started as an accident, so to speak, that he was dealing with a fractured leg and did not have the old poultice and cauterization available, and he covered the wound with carbolic acid, and the fracture healed. And so this again gave an idea that as to how things are interconnected, because creosote, a coal tar product, was used to protect ships, which were problem with barnacles. And so the extension was logical, and after this he started promoting the use of carbolic acid in his own surgery, and his results were rather impressive, as it is evidenced in the first article that he published in the newly established British Medical Journal as a new method of treating fractures and abscesses by Dr. Joseph Lister, Fellow of the Royal College of Surgery. Now at that time the centre of enlightenment was more in the north of England, in Scotland, and so this was one of the first solid proof about antisepsis. Joseph Lister is considered the father of antiseptic surgery, and this was so he had convinced that the microorganisms were the source of infection, and the way to prevent them would be by using clean antiseptic.
years before becoming a professor of chemistry at the University of Lille. In 1854, he began studying the problem of spoilage with beer, wine, and milk.
He proved that the reason these beverages were spoiling was because bacteria and other microorganisms were coming in from the outside air. He developed a process called pasteurization, where these liquids are boiled and then cooled, thereby getting rid of the bacteria and microorganisms.
When you say pasteurization, most people are linking it to milk or to food products, but actually it has much more long-lasting consequences. For example, we pasteurize medical instruments, which prevents spread of disease.
Pasteur realized that if germs were the cause of fermentation, then they could also be the cause of contagious diseases. It is because of his research that we now know to wash our hands to prevent getting sick.
Before the development of germ theory, surgeons and doctors didn't think that something as tiny as a germ could actually hurt something as large as a human being. So they often didn't even wash their hands before cutting into people. And in those days, surgery was often a death sentence.
It's through Pasteur's work that people understood that these infectious diseases were caused by bacteria as well as fungi that were coming in from the environment and invading the body.
Despite skepticism from the medical community, Pasteur continued with his research on germ theory. Eventually, he not only was able to explain the causes of many diseases, but figured out a way to prevent them.
The concept of vaccines wasn't new. Pasteur's unique contribution was to take the actual bacteria responsible for these diseases, weaken it in the lab, and then reintroduce it as a vaccine in susceptible people.
Some of the diseases that Pasteur's vaccinations were able to cure were anthrax, cholera, TB, and smallpox.
The French Academy of Sciences finally accepted the results from Pasteur's germ theory experiments in 1864.
Louis Pasteur gave us an understanding of sterile technique and the importance of antisepsis within medicine.
In 1888, the Pasteur Institute in Paris was created to further Pasteur's research, which continues to this day. Louis Pasteur died on September 28, 1895.
Louis Pasteur's legacy is felt every day in the modern world, and all of us are familiar with his work, whether we know it or not. Pasteurization, the theory of viruses, modern vaccines, hospital cleanliness. Without Pasteur's work, many of us wouldn't even be alive today.
The origin of anesthesia dates back to the late 1800s, when an English minister, Joseph Priestley, that's really his name, started experimenting with the gases that emerged after pouring nitric acid over brass. This formed what he called nitrous air, known today as nitric oxide. Then he mixed this gas with iron filings and mercury to form dephlogisticated nitrous air, or what we now call nitrous oxide. He made a better minister in the end, though. He tried to use the newly discovered gas to cure intestinal diseases. The method? Insufflating the bowels. It wasn't until the 19th century when Humphrey Davy, who abandoned his formal education to study Priestley's work on gases, built an airtight room to breathe nitrous oxide. Previously thought to be deadly, breathing nitrous, he found it produced euphoria as well as analgesia. It appears capable of destroying physical pain, he said, and might be advantageous during surgery. His findings would still go largely unnoticed for nearly 50 years. It did, however, find some entertaining benefits in the meantime, shown here as Davy administers laughing gas as a prescription for scolding wives. But on December 10th, 1844, everything would change. This is the night when med school dropout and showman Gardner Colton was demonstrating the effects of nitrous oxide when his volunteer seriously injured his leg, but get this, showed no signs of pain. Horace Wells, a local dentist that just happened to be in attendance that night, watched in amazement. A light went off in his head. He had Colton administer nitrous oxide the following day for an extraction of one of his own teeth, proving that this new gas would blunt painful responses. Unfortunately, when Wells tried to demonstrate his findings at Massachusetts General Hospital, it flopped. Literally, his patient cried out in pain, unable to hold still. Wells' life spiraled out of control with a chloroform addiction, and eventually he anesthetized himself with his drug and used a straight razor to cut an artery in his leg. He ended his life. The glory of anesthetic gas discovery went instead to Wells' former colleague. On October 16, 1846, William Morton used ether to anesthetize a patient for the removal of a neck mass. The patient stated that he felt no pain. After that, the use of ether for surgical procedures spread rapidly. There is some debate as to who credit really goes to, but it was the painless removal of this neck tumor that led to its popularity. Ether had its downsides, though, like high likelihood of nausea and vomiting, delayed emergence, and flammability. Alternatives emerged, and John Snow, considered to be the first anesthesiologist, popularized chloroform. Also, nitrous oxide reemerged when Gardner Colton, the med school dropout, administered it successfully during thousands of dental procedures.
Meet my friend. This is Andrew Sokolov from Russia. Now, he died in the 19th century, and he is famous here because his skull is part of the Josef Hertel skull collection. These were skulls gathered from throughout Eastern Europe in the mid-19th century. Now, this young man died of a self-inflicted wound. He tried to castrate himself, and in cutting off his testicles, he died. Why did he do this? He was a member of a religious sect called the Skopsi. Now, these people were persecuted for this, but they believed that the path of purification of the soul involved reduction of the carnal appetites. Women cut off their own breasts, men castrated themselves, but they waited till they had one child first. So I invite you to come down to the Mutter Museum. Do not castrate yourself first, but instead come and meet Andrew and bring your friends.
For more exciting videos about the Mutter Museum, log on to youtube.com/themuttermuseum.
American heart surgery was a well-known surgeon named Dr. William Halsted, who worked at the famous Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was one of the big four giants. He started out from New York. He grew up in a wealthy family, and in spite of reservations from his friends, he succeeded in medicine, and then went on to successful career as surgery. He was wealthy enough. He established his own surgical suite at Columbia. Then he was recruited at Johns Hopkins, and that he pioneered aseptic technique. And his nurse used to get chapped hands, so he requested Goodyear Tire Company to make gloves, and that was the introduction of gloves in modern surgery. And he's credited to have done the first gallbladder surgery, and he devised a drastic operation called radical mastectomy for breast cancer, which was in vogue until the 70s. And that was a rather disfiguring surgery, but it was pioneered, and it did cure a large number of people. And he was introduced to using cocaine for local anesthesia, but as very little was known about the addiction potential, he fell into addiction, cocaine himself, which initially gave him a big buzz and power. And to counteract those effects, he started using morphine. And in spite of counseling from his colleagues at Hopkins, he still kept falling into the recurrent lapse of morphine abuse and had developed tolerance for morphine. In addition, he is also credited with establishing a very rigorous training program, so-called pyramidal system in surgery, that it took years, almost 7 years, to become a trained house surgeon under Dr. Halstead. And several of his trainees went on to establish their own similar surgical programs. And when he was in New York, he established what is currently known as the hospital records. So he was way ahead of his time, but unfortunately had succumbed to his problems with addiction, but still continued to contribute to American medicine and surgical techniques.
And Cushing continued to push the boundaries of progress and innovation. Cushing's 2000th brain tumor operation celebrated his accomplishments and his success as a brain surgeon. He had trained most of the leaders of neurosurgery departments in the United States. The transatlantic direction of traffic for neurosurgical learning reversed. Cushing is rightfully the father of modern neurosurgery, and his founding principles of professional persistence in the face of adversity, innovation, and willingness to challenge dogma, as well as his self-sacrifice to fulfill his passion to advance our discipline, remain the cornerstones that define the best of us today.